Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. The winter Victor Calloway turned 12 was the season he learned that security was an illusion people rented until life demanded it back. The town where he grew up sat beneath a permanent veil of factory smoke, its streets lined with narrow brick houses that seemed to lean toward one another for warmth. His father, Walter Calloway, had spent 22 years inside the ironworks plant, leaving home before sunrise and returning with metal dust clinging stubbornly to the creases of his skin. That December morning, Walter did not go to work. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee cooled, his broad shoulders curved inward as though the weight of invisible steel beams pressed against them. Victor noticed the silence first. His mother, Margaret Calloway, usually hummed while preparing breakfast, but that day her movements were careful, almost ceremonial. When Walter finally spoke, his voice carried none of the thunder Victor associated with him. The plant had shut down overnight. No warning. No severance strong enough to matter. Just locked gates and a notice stapled to rusted metal. Victor watched the words land on his mother's face like falling glass. Something hardened inside him then, not anger, not fear, but a quiet vow that he would never allow his life to depend on forces he could not control. Margaret adapted faster than grief expected. Within weeks, their dining room transformed into a sewing workspace, fabrics stacked like fragile architecture along the walls. She took orders from neighbors, then from boutiques in neighboring towns, her reputation growing with every perfectly tailored seam. Victor often stayed awake past midnight listening to the steady rhythm of her machine. That sound became, in his young mind, the pulse of survival. Walter searched tirelessly for work, pride refusing to let him accept positions he believed would reduce him. Yet it was Margaret who taught Victor the lesson that truly anchored him. Stability is not given, it is engineered through persistence. He began helping however he could, delivering finished garments, managing small ledgers, calculating costs with a precision unusual for someone his age. Numbers fascinated him because they obeyed logic, unlike people or fortune. Teachers quickly noticed his analytical mind, but what they did not see was the deeper driver behind it, the memory of his father staring at an uncertain future. By 16, Victor was already building small ventures. He repaired discarded electronics, resold them for modest profit, and reinvested every dollar. While other teenagers chased fleeting thrills, Victor chased leverage. His closest friend, Adrian Pierce, once asked why he worked as though time itself were hunting him. Victor answered with unusual calm, because poverty doesn't knock before entering. That same year, Walter finally found employment managing logistics for a regional distributor. The relief inside the household was profound but measured. The Calloways had learned not to celebrate too loudly. On the night Victor received acceptance into one of the nation's most competitive business universities, Walter placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and said something Victor would carry forever: wealth isn't about money. It's about never having to watch the people you love panic. Victor did not yet understand how deeply those words would shape his future marriage, his tests of loyalty, and the painful discoveries waiting decades ahead. But the blueprint had already been drafted. University life unfolded like a vast chessboard, and Victor moved across it with deliberate calculation. The campus itself radiated ambition, glass-fronted lecture halls, students who spoke casually about venture capital, professors who measured potential in billions rather than thousands. Victor felt neither intimidated nor dazzled. He felt alert. He studied markets the way some studied literature, searching for patterns in human behavior. It was during his second year that he met Leonard Gray, a mathematics prodigy whose social awkwardness masked a mind capable of predicting financial fluctuations with startling accuracy. Their partnership began almost accidentally during a late-night economics competition. While others argued theories, Victor proposed a structured investment simulation so precise that the faculty advisor quietly asked where he had learned such modeling. Victor simply replied, "From watching what happens when people don't plan." Adrian Pierce attended the same university but pursued technology engineering with restless enthusiasm. Unlike Victor, Adrian embraced risk with visible excitement, often dragging Victor into debates about innovation versus caution. Their differences created balance. Adrian envisioned futures, Victor built safeguards around them. Together with Leonard, they launched a modest analytics platform from a cramped apartment filled with cables and empty coffee cups. The software predicted supply chain inefficiencies, and within a year several mid-sized firms subscribed. Victor insisted on reinvesting profits rather than celebrating prematurely. Momentum, he told them, dies the moment you think you've arrived. That discipline soon attracted attention from larger investors, though Victor accepted funding only after negotiating terms that preserved control. Power, he believed, should never be borrowed cheaply. Success accelerated quietly but unmistakably. By graduation, Victor had already structured the foundation of what would become Calloway Holdings, a diversified enterprise focused on logistics technology, infrastructure forecasting, and strategic acquisitions. Yet amid this upward trajectory, Margaret's letters remained his emotional anchor. She wrote not about pride, but about character, reminding him that wealth magnifies whatever already lives inside a person. During a celebratory dinner after their first major contract, Adrian toasted Victor as inevitable. Victor responded with a faint smile but later confessed to Leonard that inevitability frightened him. Rapid ascent often attracted people who loved altitude more than the climber. Leonard, ever pragmatic, suggested thorough background checks on future partners. Victor agreed, though he could not have predicted that the greatest threat to his emotional security would one day come not from a business rival, but from the person he trusted most within his private world. Years later, Calloway Holdings occupied an entire tower overlooking a river that reflected the city's electric glow. Victor's leadership style became legendary, calm during crises, ruthless toward inefficiency, but unexpectedly generous toward employees facing genuine hardship. He funded education programs quietly and established emergency relief funds without attaching his name. To the public, he appeared composed, almost immune to vulnerability. Only Adrian understood the deeper truth. Victor was not unemotional, he was carefully guarded. The memory of instability had matured into a relentless need for control. When journalists asked what drove him, Victor answered simply, freedom. What he did not say was that freedom, to him, meant never again watching love tremble under financial strain. Victor met Deborah Eric on an evening designed to celebrate excess. The charity gala shimmered beneath chandeliers large enough to resemble suspended constellations, each crystal scattering light across polished marble floors. Deborah did not enter loudly, she entered with gravitational ease, conversations subtly bending toward her presence. She possessed the kind of composure that suggested lifelong familiarity with admiration. Raised in an affluent coastal enclave, Deborah was the daughter of Charles Eric, a real estate magnate whose developments reshaped skylines, and Lorraine Eric, a former concert pianist who believed refinement was a language children must learn early. Deborah grew fluent in that language, trained in ballet, educated in elite schools, and taught that perception often outweighed reality. Yet beneath the cultivated grace lived an intelligence sharpened by observation. She could read a room within seconds. Their introduction came through Serafina Vale, Deborah's closest friend and a rapidly rising divorce attorney known for her unapologetic pragmatism. Serafina enjoyed orchestrating encounters she believed would ripple through high society, and pairing Deborah with the elusive Victor Calloway felt irresistible. When Victor extended his hand, Deborah noticed immediately that his gaze did not wander the way others often did in her presence. He listened more than he spoke, answering questions with thoughtful precision. That restraint intrigued her. Victor, in turn, sensed both warmth and calculation in Deborah, a duality he found compelling rather than alarming. They spoke about architecture, travel, and the psychology of risk. Hours dissolved unnoticed. Courtship unfolded with deliberate elegance. Victor preferred meaningful gestures over grand displays, private museum tours, quiet coastal retreats, evenings discussing books neither had time to finish. Deborah appreciated the stability he radiated. After years of navigating performative social circles, his authenticity felt rare. She confided ambitions beyond ornamental philanthropy, expressing interest in strategic investments and cultural initiatives. Victor encouraged her curiosity, admiring her capacity to think structurally. Adrian, observing from the periphery, once remarked that Deborah seemed perfectly engineered for Victor's world. Victor responded with something close to wonder, "She doesn't need my world. She builds her own." That belief deepened his emotional investment. Their engagement captivated media outlets, though Victor negotiated fiercely for privacy. The wedding balanced grandeur with intimacy, an oceanfront ceremony where wind carried soft music across gathered family and trusted friends. Walter and Margaret watched with tearful pride, convinced their son had found not merely a partner but a sanctuary. Deborah's parents approved wholeheartedly. Victor represented both prestige and stability. As vows were exchanged, Victor experienced an unfamiliar sensation: release. For the first time since childhood, he allowed himself to imagine that love might exist without hidden conditions. Deborah, radiant beneath twilight skies, appeared equally certain. Neither recognized how subtly expectations can evolve once comfort becomes routine. Marriage began not with turbulence but with harmony polished to near perfection. Their residence overlooked a sweeping expanse of water, its architecture blending modern clarity with warm textures Deborah selected herself. She approached the design as both art and strategy, creating spaces that encouraged connection: sunlit breakfast rooms, a library scented faintly of cedar, terraces meant for quiet reflection. Victor admired her instinct for atmosphere. She understood that environments shape emotional rhythms. Early mornings often found them sharing coffee while reviewing headlines, Deborah teasing Victor about his disciplined schedule. He found her laughter restorative, a counterbalance to corporate intensity. Deborah cultivated philanthropic initiatives focused on arts education, quickly earning respect beyond social circles. She possessed a natural ability to persuade donors, her sincerity difficult to question. Victor supported her endeavors wholeheartedly, establishing a foundation that allowed her projects to scale. Observers frequently described them as complementary forces, his analytical rigor paired with her relational intelligence. Adrian, during one dinner, confessed mild envy at how effortlessly they appeared aligned. Victor answered with rare softness, "Alignment takes work. We just choose it daily." At the time, he believed this completely. Yet small divergences began emerging almost invisibly. Deborah thrived amid vibrant gatherings, while Victor increasingly preferred curated company. She encouraged more frequent travel, spontaneous purchases, broader expansions into lifestyle investments. Victor did not object. Prosperity allowed flexibility. Still, he noticed how often conversations drifted toward comparison: who acquired what, whose influence expanded where. It did not feel like greed exactly. It felt more like a rising intolerance for limits. Margaret once observed gently that abundance can recalibrate a person's definition of enough. Victor listened but dismissed the unease forming at the edges of his perception. Their 5th anniversary approached with celebratory anticipation. Victor planned a private orchestral performance featuring pieces Lorraine loved, hoping to honor Deborah's family as well as their shared journey. Deborah responded with visible emotion, embracing him longer than usual. That night, as city lights trembled across the water, Victor allowed himself to believe that he had achieved the rare equilibrium between success and intimacy. He could not yet see how ambition, when subtly redirected inward, can reshape devotion into something transactional. For now, their life appeared not only stable, but enviable. Pressure rarely announces itself dramatically. It accumulates through quiet expectations. Calloway Holdings entered a period of aggressive expansion, requiring Victor to travel frequently. Deborah adapted outwardly, yet solitude altered her routines. Serafina's visits grew more frequent, their conversations stretching late into evenings scented with expensive candles. Serafina, immersed daily in marital dissolutions, often spoke about independence with persuasive certainty. She argued that modern partnerships should never require self-reduction. Deborah listened thoughtfully, occasionally defending Victor but absorbing the underlying philosophy: security should never depend entirely on another person. Meanwhile, Lucien Eric, Deborah's younger brother, reappeared with familiar urgency. His art dealership hovered perpetually between promise and collapse, sustained largely by Deborah's discreet financial interventions. She loved Lucien fiercely, remembering childhood afternoons when they escaped rigid household expectations together. Yet supporting him demanded increasing resources. Rather than burden Victor, she began reallocating funds from personal accounts, rationalizing that transparency could wait until stability returned. Each decision felt temporary, almost administrative. Still, secrecy, once introduced, tends to normalize itself. Victor sensed a tonal shift he struggled to define. Deborah remained affectionate but seemed more preoccupied, her attention occasionally fragmenting mid-conversation. Adrian noticed it too during a dinner where Deborah checked messages repeatedly. Later, Adrian asked whether everything felt steady at home. Victor answered affirmatively but spent that night awake longer than usual, replaying subtle exchanges. He reminded himself that marriages evolve. Closeness is not constant performance. Yet an unfamiliar thought surfaced. What if harmony had been partially sustained by the illusion of endless ascent? Seeking reconnect Ion, Victor proposed an extended retreat. No assistance, no obligations. Deborah agreed warmly, and for several days they rediscovered easy laughter while hiking coastal cliffs and cooking imperfect meals together. Watching her there, hair unguarded by formal styling, Victor felt reassured. Whatever tensions existed seemed dissolvable through attention. He returned home convinced that vigilance, not suspicion, was the healthier posture. What he did not realize was that parallel narratives can unfold within the same relationship, one visible, one quietly drafting its own momentum. Dominic Voss entered Deborah's orbit through what appeared an innocuous professional introduction. A private investment symposium invited Deborah to join a panel discussing cultural funding strategies. Dominic, presenting on global asset mobility, spoke with polished clarity about protecting wealth against volatility. His charisma did not rely on volume, it relied on certainty. Deborah appreciated expertise, and Dominic projected it effortlessly. After the session, he complimented her insights with a specificity that suggested genuine attention rather than rehearsed charm. Their subsequent meetings remained strictly professional at first. Dominic reviewed portions of Deborah's philanthropic portfolio, proposing structures that could enhance long-term impact while preserving liquidity. He listened intently, remembered details others overlooked, and framed recommendations as collaborations rather than corrections. Deborah found the intellectual partnership stimulating. In a world where many responded to her surname before her ideas, Dominic engaged her as a strategist. That recognition carried quiet power. Victor met Dominic briefly during a reception and registered him as competent but unremarkable within the vast ecosystem of financial advisors. Leonard conducted standard due diligence and found no immediate irregularities. Satisfied, Victor returned focus to corporate negotiations consuming his attention. Deborah mentioned Dominic occasionally, describing innovative frameworks that intrigued her. Victor encouraged exploration. He trusted her judgment. Over time, however, Dominic's counsel expanded beyond investments into broader conversations about autonomy. He spoke of individuals who lost agency by conflating marriage with dependency. Deborah did not perceive manipulation, only perspective. Still, seeds once planted tend to seek growth. She began contemplating scenarios she had never previously entertained. What if circumstances changed abruptly? What safeguards truly belonged to her? These questions felt pragmatic rather than disloyal. Yet each inquiry subtly repositioned trust from shared ground toward individual contingency. One evening, after reviewing projected philanthropic expansions, Dominic remarked calmly, "Preparedness is not pessimism, it's sovereignty." Deborah carried that phrase home, repeating it silently as she moved through rooms Victor believed symbolized their unity. She still loved him, or believed she did, but love was gradually sharing space with an emerging devotion to personal insulation. The shift was nearly imperceptible, like a compass adjusting by fractions until direction itself transforms. The idea of testing devotion did not arrive dramatically for Victor. It emerged through accumulated impressions too coherent to dismiss. A delayed dinner Deborah forgot, a conversation truncated by unexplained urgency, financial summaries that seemed unusually compartmentalized. None constituted betrayal, yet together they unsettled him. Adrian, never inclined toward gentle phrasing, suggested candid dialogue. Victor considered it but hesitated. Accusations without evidence corrode more surely than silence. Instead, he consulted Helena Roth, whose reputation for strategic clarity bordered on legendary. In her minimalist office overlooking the legal district, Victor outlined his concerns with measured restraint. Helena listened without interruption, then proposed a controlled scenario, not deception for cruelty's sake, but a diagnostic stress test. If their bond rested on something deeper than circumstance, adversity would reveal it. Leonard confirmed the feasibility of constructing a temporary financial freeze narrative fully compliant with regulations. The plan would involve coordinated announcements suggesting assets under investigation, restricting liquidity while protecting actual holdings. Victor wrestled privately with the ethics. Margaret's teachings echoed within him. Trust should not be engineered. Yet another memory competed, the sight of Walter facing sudden loss. Preparedness, Victor believed, was not cynicism, it was stewardship. After nights of reflection, he authorized the simulation. Only a handful of individuals would know the truth. Adrian expressed discomfort but pledged support, recognizing Victor's need for certainty. The announcement broke on an otherwise ordinary morning. Market commentators speculated rapidly. Media outlets dissected implications with predictable intensity. Victor returned home earlier than usual, carrying none of his customary composure. Deborah listened as he explained the supposed freeze, her expression shifting first to disbelief, then something sharper. He waited for reassurance, for shared resolve. Instead, she asked questions focused almost exclusively on duration and personal exposure. Victor answered carefully, observing rather than reacting. A quiet fracture formed within him, not yet confirmation, but the unmistakable sensation that a fault line had been located. That night, while Deborah slept, Victor stood alone on the terrace watching distant aircraft lights traverse the sky. He told himself that whatever surfaced next would at least replace uncertainty with truth. Still, he could not suppress a single aching hope that the woman he loved would choose partnership over preservation. Deborah adapted swiftly, but not in the way Victor had imagined. Within days, her schedule reorganized itself around private calls and discreet meetings. She framed them as precautionary consultations, a narrative reasonable enough to deflect curiosity. Yet her warmth cooled noticeably, replaced by a brisk efficiency that made their home feel strangely transactional. Victor, maintaining the role of a man navigating collapse, observed with disciplined stillness. Dominic intensified his presence under the guise of strategic guidance. He outlined jurisdictional advantages, asset protections, mobility pathways should regulatory pressure expand. Deborah absorbed the information with growing urgency. What unsettled Victor most was not action alone but the absence of emotional solidarity. She did not ask how he endured the scrutiny, she asked how quickly constraints might touch her lifestyle. The distinction cut deeper than overt hostility could have. Leonard quietly flagged irregular transfers from accounts Deborah controlled, amount significant enough to suggest premeditation. Victor authorized continued monitoring while resisting the impulse to confront prematurely. Helena reminded him that clarity required patience. Meanwhile, Adrian's loyalty manifested through proximity. He visited often, offering conversation deliberately unrelated to crisis, as though normalcy itself could fortify Victor's composure. One evening, returning unexpectedly, Victor heard Deborah speaking in low tones behind a closed study door. He caught only fragments, timelines, confirmations, references to relocation. The words did not yet constitute proof, but intuition sharpened into near certainty. Still, he waited. Truth, once revealed incompletely, invites denial. He intended to meet it whole. Deborah, for her part, justified every step internally. Preparedness, she reminded herself, was wisdom. If Victor recovered, these measures would remain invisible safeguards. If he did not, she would not be dragged into uncertainty. The reasoning felt almost virtuous. Yet somewhere beneath the logic flickered a quieter awareness. She had begun planning a future that did not require his presence. The recording reached Victor on a rain-polished afternoon that seemed determined to mute the city. Detective Rowan Hale, recommended by Helena for his discretion, delivered it without theatricality. Captured through lawful surveillance tied to financial anomalies, the audio documented a conversation between Deborah and Dominic unmistakably intimate in both tone and intent. Deborah referenced funds already relocated, $1 million secured beyond immediate reach, and discussed departure logistics with chilling composure. Dominic's reassurances blended affection with calculation, promising a life unencumbered by investigations or diminished status. Victor listened once, then again, each repetition stripping residual doubt. Pain arrived not as eruption but as compression, a silent constriction around memories he had once considered inviolable. He thought of the vows beneath ocean wind, of mornings scented with coffee, of the belief that love had finally rendered him safe from the instability he feared as a boy. Adrian found him hours later still seated, the device resting motionless in his hand. No anger surfaced, only a profound, clarifying sorrow. Helena transitioned swiftly from strategist to protector, outlining legal pathways. The transfers constituted actionable misconduct. Coordination with authorities could prevent further dissipation. Victor agreed, though the decision felt less like retaliation than necessary containment. Detective Hale assured him that timing would matter. Allowing Deborah to proceed until intent crystallized would eliminate ambiguity in court. At home, Victor maintained a facade with remarkable steadiness. Deborah interpreted his quiet as defeat, mistaking composure for resignation. She increased preparations, unaware that each movement now unfolded within a narrowing perimeter. One evening she studied travel itineraries while Victor described imaginary meetings with restructuring advisors. Their dialogue resembled theater performed for an audience of two, each guarding a separate script. Later that night, Victor walked through rooms that once symbolized shared aspiration. Objects appeared unchanged, meaning had not. He realized then that wealth had never been his greatest vulnerability, trust had. Yet amid the grief, another sensation stirred faintly: resolve. Whatever followed would hurt, but it would also liberate him from illusion. Departure morning arrived cloaked in deceptive calm. Deborah moved through the house with measured precision, luggage aligned discreetly near a service entrance. She intended to leave before dawn 2 days later, minimizing visibility. Dominic messaged confirmations from abroad, his confidence unwavering. Deborah felt a tremor of anticipation rather than guilt, interpreting her choice as strategic evolution rather than abandonment. Victor chose that evening to speak the words he had rehearsed countless times internally: "I told my wife we were broke." He delivered the statement without embellishment, describing final asset freezes and uncertain recovery. Deborah's response, sharpened by impatience, abandoned pretense. She mocked his supposed miscalculations, questioned how a man celebrated for foresight could fail so completely. Each sentence etched finality into Victor's understanding. Still, he revealed nothing of what he knew. Authorities arrived the following afternoon under the authority of warrants prepared meticulously. Detective Hale led the team with quiet professionalism. Deborah's surprise fractured quickly into indignation, then disbelief as evidence was presented. Victor remained composed, neither accusatory nor triumphant. Dominic, alerted too late, vanished from communication channels with practiced efficiency, prioritizing self-preservation exactly as Helena predicted. Legal proceedings accelerated with the weight of recorded intent and documented transfers. In the stark geometry of the courtroom, audio played with devastating clarity. Deborah listened to her own voice outlining escape, each word dissolving the narrative she might have constructed in defense. Victor attended without spectacle, answering questions precisely, refusing dramatics. Observers later remarked on his restraint. Only Adrian recognized the discipline required to sustain it. When the verdict concluded, silence settled heavily. Deborah's gaze sought Victor once, not pleading, not apologetic, but searching for something unnamed. He offered no visible reaction. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion, traffic threading through intersections as though personal cataclysms barely registered against its vast rhythm. Victor stepped into the open air aware that an era of his life had ended, not with the explosive fury he once imagined betrayal would provoke, but with a sober clarity that felt, strangely, like the first breath after submersion. Victor returned to a home transformed by absence. Echo replaced conversation. Routines unraveled without resistance. Work provided structure, yet evenings stretched longer than before. Margaret visited often, her presence gentle but grounding. She did not interrogate his choices. She simply reminded him that survival sometimes requires releasing the version of life we believed permanent. It was during this recalibration that Victor met Elena Marlowe. Assigned as senior liaison to stabilize legitimate accounts amid public scrutiny, she approached her role with composed professionalism. Elena's background differed markedly from Deborah's. The daughter of Arthur Marlowe, a literature professor who prized introspection over display, she had grown up in a household where conversations mattered more than appearances. Her career reflected that ethos, methodical, ethical, quietly distinguished. Their initial meetings focused strictly on financial clarity, yet Victor noticed how Elena listened without agenda. She asked not only what structures existed, but what outcomes would restore his sense of direction. There was no fascination with his wealth, no performative sympathy, only steady competence paired with understated warmth. For the first time in months, Victor felt conversation flow without guarded calculation. One evening, after concluding a particularly complex review, Elena mentioned her father's favorite observation: "That peace is the only prosperity no market can revoke." The phrase lingered with Victor long after she left. He realized that while betrayal had dismantled his certainty, it had not erased his capacity to trust again, it had merely refined it. Standing by the window as dusk softened the skyline, Victor sensed that what lay ahead would not resemble the life he lost. It might, however, become something quieter, stronger, and infinitely more genuine. The weeks following the trial did not bring Victor Calloway the relief outsiders assumed would naturally follow justice. Instead, life settled into a peculiar stillness that felt heavier than grief itself. Newspapers gradually shifted their attention toward fresher scandals, yet the silence inside his home remained unchanged, stretching across hallways that once carried Deborah's laughter. He developed the habit of waking before dawn, not from anxiety but from a mind unwilling to rest fully. On one such morning, he walked barefoot across the cold marble floor and paused beside the panoramic window overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered like distant constellations dissolving into sunrise, and for the first time, Victor allowed himself to admit that he was profoundly lonely, not because Deborah was gone, but because the future he had imagined no longer existed. Adrian Pierce refused to let isolation root too deeply. He began appearing unannounced with takeout dinners, deliberately steering conversations toward technology ventures, travel, and occasionally ridiculous memories from their university days. Adrian understood something essential: Victor did not need interrogation, he needed normalcy. Meanwhile, Margaret suggested small rituals, shared Sunday meals, long walks without agenda. During one of those walks, she spoke gently about forgiveness, clarifying that it does not excuse betrayal but frees the wounded from living inside it. Victor listened without responding immediately. Forgiveness felt distant, yet the idea that his life could expand again no longer seemed impossible. Professionally, Victor redirected his energy toward restructuring divisions he had neglected during the emotional storm. Employees noticed a subtle evolution in his leadership. He remained precise but displayed a new attentiveness toward their personal aspirations, as though the collapse of his marriage had sharpened his understanding of human fragility. Leonard Gray observed privately that adversity had not hardened Victor, it had refined him. Late one evening, after reviewing quarterly projections, Victor realized something quietly transformative. The test he designed to reveal Deborah's loyalty had also revealed his own resilience. He had survived the fracture. Now he faced a more delicate challenge, learning how to live without anticipating betrayal at every turn. Elena Marlowe's presence in Victor's professional orbit grew steadily, though never intrusively. She approached financial recovery not as damage control but as a deliberate re-establishment of clarity. During strategy sessions, she demonstrated a remarkable ability to translate complex structures into calm certainty, her voice carrying neither condescension nor theatrical authority. Victor found himself respecting her judgment long before he noticed how naturally their conversations drifted beyond spreadsheets. Elena's life, by contrast, was shaped by intellectual modesty rather than spectacle. Her father, Arthur Marlowe, lived in a book-lined cottage where afternoon sunlight seemed permanently filtered through the pages of open novels. When Victor eventually met him at a small dinner Elena hosted, Arthur spoke about literature's quiet power to help people reinterpret pain. "Stories remind us," he said thoughtfully, "that endings are often disguised transitions." Victor carried that sentence home like an unexpected gift. Their connection deepened through shared patience rather than dramatic confession. Elena never pressed him to discuss Deborah. She allowed disclosures to surface organically. One evening, after a long review session extended into twilight, Victor admitted that what unsettled him most was not the betrayal itself but how convincingly love had once appeared. Elena responded with measured warmth: "Authenticity doesn't become false just because someone abandons it. What you offered was real." The simplicity of her reassurance reached places elaborate comfort never could. Over time, Victor noticed how peaceful he felt in her company. There were no performances to decode, no strategic undertones. She laughed easily but listened even more easily, a rare equilibrium. Adrian, perceptive as ever, remarked after meeting her briefly, She doesn't seem interested in your empire. Victor answered quietly, "That might be why I trust her." For the first time since the trial, hope entered his life without demanding permission. While Victor's world edged toward renewal, Deborah Eric confronted a reality stripped of illusion. Prison was not the theatrical misery she once imagined. It was more sobering than that, structured, predictable, and relentlessly introspective. Days unfolded according to bells and schedules, leaving little room to outrun one's own thoughts. Initially, indignation sustained her. She framed herself as someone who had merely planned for survival. Yet anger proved exhausting when there was no audience left to persuade. Gradually, Deborah observed the quiet dignity of other inmates rebuilding themselves through education programs and counseling circles. Their stories differed, yet a common thread emerged. Most had once believed consequences belonged to other people. That recognition unsettled her more deeply than the sentence itself. She began volunteering in the prison library, rediscovering a long-dormant love for biographies. Reading about lives dismantled and rebuilt forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her downfall had not been engineered by Dominic or circumstance, but by choices she alone authorized. Letters from Lucien arrived sporadically, heavy with remorse. He confessed that the financial support she had hidden from Victor had fueled risks he should never have taken. Rather than blame her, he expressed determination to stabilize his own life, promising that her mistakes would not define their family's future. Deborah wept quietly after reading that letter, the sound barely audible beneath the institutional hum. Nights became periods of unguarded reflection. She revisited memories of Victor, not the final confrontation, but the early mornings, the gentleness she had once mistaken for permanence. For the first time, regret surfaced unaccompanied by defensiveness. She understood now that loyalty is rarely tested during abundance. It reveals itself when certainty fractures. And when Victor had needed partnership most, she had offered calculation instead. Dominic Voss, ever attuned to self-preservation, vanished with surgical efficiency once the investigation tightened. His network dissolved into unreachable numbers and politely evasive intermediaries. Yet reputations in financial circles possess long memories. Rumors spread quietly, then decisively. Prospective partners withdrew, invitations ceased. Marcus Cade, distancing himself with equal precision, issued statements emphasizing limited involvement. Dominic relocated repeatedly, attempting to reconstruct legitimacy under new affiliations. But trust, once eroded, resists reconstruction. During a tense negotiation months later, a potential client referenced the scandal indirectly, watching Dominic's reaction with clinical curiosity. Dominic realized then that reinvention would demand more than relocation. It would require confronting the very opportunism that had once seemed his greatest strength. Alone in an unfamiliar apartment overlooking a city that did not know his name, Dominic experienced a discomfort he could not charm away. Wealth without belonging felt curiously hollow. He thought briefly of Deborah, not with longing, but with the detached recognition that their alliance had always been transactional. What unsettled him was the emerging awareness that transactional living eventually impoverishes the spirit. He pivoted toward legitimate advisory work, accepting smaller contracts, relinquishing the illusion of effortless ascent. Whether this shift reflected genuine growth or pragmatic adaptation remained unclear even to him. Yet the scandal had imposed a boundary he could not negotiate around. Every future relationship would now begin beneath a shadow he himself had cast. Spring arrived with understated generosity the year Victor asked Elena to join him for a walk through a botanical garden just reopening after winter. Blossoms unfolded cautiously along winding paths, their fragrance carried by a breeze neither cold nor warm. Victor had chosen the setting deliberately, alive, but not ostentatious. As they walked, conversation settled into companionable quiet until he stopped beside a reflecting pool. "I used to think certainty was the highest form of safety," he began. "Now I think honesty might be." Elena listened, sensing the gravity beneath his calm. He spoke not of rescuing hearts or rewriting past chapters, but of the future he hoped to build, one grounded in transparency rather than assumption. When he asked whether she could imagine sharing such a life, the question felt less like a proposal and more like an invitation into mutual stewardship. Elena's answer arrived without hesitation yet carried thoughtful depth. She valued the steadiness they had cultivated, the absence of performance, the way their conversations left room for silence. "Love should feel like arriving," she said softly, "not auditioning." Victor felt something within him settle permanently. Their wedding months later reflected that philosophy. Held in a sunlit garden with close friends and family, it emphasized presence over spectacle. Margaret watched with serene joy, whispering that Victor's smile looked younger than it had in years. Adrian delivered a toast notable for its brevity. He simply thanked Elena for bringing peace where ambition alone once stood. Marriage to Elena unfolded with gentle authenticity. They argued occasionally, laughed often, and navigated decisions as partners rather than competitors. One evening, as rain traced delicate patterns across the windows, Elena placed Victor's hand over a subtle heartbeat within her. The news of their child transformed anticipation into something almost sacred. When Theo Calloway entered the world months later, Victor understood with breathtaking clarity that abundance is measured less by assets than by the people who trust you with their beginnings. Fatherhood altered Victor in ways success never had. Holding Theo for the first time, he felt both immense strength and profound vulnerability, a recognition that love expands one's capacity for both joy and fear simultaneously. Nights once devoted to financial forecasts became hours spent pacing gently with a restless infant, whispering reassurances into the quiet. Elena embraced motherhood with composed devotion, yet she insisted Victor remain fully present rather than retreating into work. Together they cultivated rituals, morning walks with the stroller, evenings reading aloud long before Theo could understand the words. Arthur Marlowe visited often, declaring that children teach adults how to inhabit the present rather than race ahead of it. Calloway Holdings continued flourishing, but Victor recalibrated his priorities. He delegated more authority, trusting teams he had carefully developed. Adrian joked that Theo might become the company's most influential shareholder simply by rearranging Victor's calendar. Beneath the humor lay truth. Victor no longer equated relentless expansion with security. One afternoon, watching Theo sleep, Victor reflected on the unlikely sequence that had guided him here. The fake bankruptcy he once dreaded had indeed dismantled his former life, but in its collapse, it cleared space for something more enduring. He understood now that control has limits. What matters is the courage to rebuild when illusions fall away. Nearly 8 years passed before Deborah wrote the letter she rewrote countless times before sending. Prison had refined her handwriting into deliberate clarity, each sentence carrying the weight of unvarnished acknowledgement. She did not justify her actions. She named them greed, fear, arrogance. She wrote of the library, the biographies, the slow dismantling of self-deception. Most importantly, she asked not for reconciliation but for forgiveness, explaining that freedom without inner reckoning would feel incomplete. When the envelope reached Victor, he opened it alone in his study while twilight softened the room. Reading it stirred memories no longer sharp but still significant. Elena, sensing the moment's gravity, offered quiet support without intrusion. Victor realized forgiveness had been germinating within him long before the letter arrived. Margaret's wisdom had taken root gradually. He agreed to meet Deborah on the day of her release, not as husband, not as adversary, but as someone prepared to close a chapter with dignity. The decision surprised Adrian less than Victor expected. Peace, Adrian observed, is often the boldest choice. On the morning of the meeting, Victor felt neither dread nor anticipation. Instead, he experienced a calm curiosity about who Deborah had become beyond the identity frozen in his memory. The reunion unfolded outside a modest transitional housing facility beneath a sky washed pale with early autumn light. Deborah stepped forward carrying a single suitcase, her posture humbler yet steady. Time had softened her features, replacing former sharpness with reflective composure. Their conversation avoided dramatics. Deborah thanked him for attending, for the fairness he had shown, for the life they once attempted to build. Victor listened, recognizing sincerity unmarred by performance. When he offered a modest financial sum to help her begin anew, he framed it carefully, not indulgence, but opportunity. Deborah accepted with quiet gratitude, understanding the gesture's symbolic grace. They spoke briefly of Lucien, now managing a small but stable gallery, and of Margaret, whose kindness Deborah still remembered. No attempt was made to resurrect familiarity. Some bonds, once broken, transform permanently into respectful distance. As they parted, Deborah expressed a final hope that Victor's life was peaceful. He answered simply, It is. Watching her walk toward an uncertain but self-directed future, Victor felt no residual bitterness, only the sober awareness that mistakes, when faced honestly, can redirect a life. That evening, Victor returned home to find Theo racing toward him with unrestrained excitement. Elena close behind, her smile carrying the quiet assurance that had first drawn him to her. The house glowed warmly, alive with the gentle chaos of family life. Later, standing together on the terrace, Victor reflected aloud that his first marriage had been constructed partly on assumptions neither partner examined closely enough. Elena responded with characteristic insight, sometimes what collapses clears the ground for something truer. Victor watched the city lights shimmer once more, but they no longer resembled distant constellations. They felt companionable, part of a world he inhabited fully rather than observed cautiously. The fear of poverty that once governed him had evolved into a deeper understanding, that wealth without trust is merely architecture without shelter. Inside, Theo's laughter echoed, and Victor recognized the quiet miracle of second chances. The bankruptcy he had staged years ago had indeed marked the end of one life. Yet from that deliberate ruin emerged a family anchored not in illusion, but in authenticity. And as Victor closed the terrace doors behind him, stepping back into warmth and belonging, he understood with serene certainty that some losses are not endings at all, they are precise invitations to begin again. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.